Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining after lunch. I know a lot of people are still enjoying the really good desserts we have here. I'll try to keep it short and nice and spicy and controversial so that keeps you awake during your digestion. My name is Thierry Carrez. I'm the general manager for the OpenInfra Foundation, which you may better know under the name OpenStack Foundation, which was our previous name. I'm also elected to the board of the Open Source Initiative, where I currently serve as the vice chair. And that's actually as part of my OSI activities that I got into contact with this topic. We were preparing a response for the functional software license, which was one of those non-compete licenses that so-called open source companies are churning out recently. And as part of building the response for the organization to this new release, I reflected back on the recent relicensing that we've seen happening around the open source world, most notably at HashiCorp. You might have seen that one. And I was surprised by how much those organizations using those licenses or pushing those new licenses had in common with proprietary software companies. And so I did this talk at FOSDEM, and we turned it into a blog post that was posted on the opensource.net website. And I would say that the reaction to it was pretty polarized. On one hand, you would have people that would really enjoy it, like the FOSDEM attendants really enjoyed it. A lot of people came to me after the talk saying that I put into words things that they were already thinking, and that was great. And on the other side, you had people that really hated it, or at least disliked it a lot, said that it was a bit naive, that it was also counterproductive and harming the open source ecosystem. And some of them are in this room, so well, this is not necessarily a crowd that should be as sympathetic to this argument as the FOSDEM one. So it should be very interesting to see how you react. But how you would react to it depended a lot on whether you would consider yourself a single vendor open source, part of a single vendor open source company or not. And because people that were identifying as single vendor open source really disliked it for some reason. And I guess I should clarify what I mean by single vendor open source to start with, because in a lot of cases, those people were not what I would consider single vendor open source companies. To me, single vendor open source software is when software is released under an open source license, but only one organization is allowed to contribute to the code. And by allowed, I mean it's by design, not by accident. So if you started an open source project, you welcome contributions, but nobody is really showing up to help with it. That's not really single vendor. To me, it's you created an open source project that's collaborative and everything, but nobody is really interested because your topic is so specialized or whatever. That's not single vendor open source in my book. If your governance is open to people outside of your organization and yet nobody steps up, that's also not single vendor to me. So with that said, I want to start with this. So all the relicensing that we've seen happening, and I should probably switch slides even if they don't have so much. All of the relicensing that's been happening lately has been following the same narrative around open source. And the story goes like this. In the 60s and 70s, at the dawn of the computer age, only hardware mattered. You had some very expensive pieces of hardware that was sold by mostly IBM. And everything that was critical was happening at the hardware layer. The software was more of an afterthought shared across the users of those machines and shared freely between those users. It's only with the 80s and the rise of the personal computer that we commoditized this hardware layer, and software was much more important because you had so many more places where the software would run. And that's when the software companies like Microsoft were created, and with it, the proprietary software approach. Proprietary software approach is when a single entity owns the software that is produced and intends to capture all the value that derives from it thanks to restrictive licensing. And so we've seen with that approach in the 90s, we've seen that approach led to a lot of excesses as companies like Microsoft really exploited that dominant position that they had and tried to extract as much value as they could from their captive users. And openly developed open source software grew in the 90s in reaction to this evil proprietary approach, as a reaction to it. And that's when we've seen in that model, software is produced as a commons by a group of organizations, and they collaborate openly, and they share the fruits and the value that is created within that software. It's made possible thanks to open source licenses, which guarantee a number of freedoms, including the freedom to build on it freely without asking for permission, but also the freedom to use it for any purpose, including making money. So in the next 20 years, open source got overwhelmingly popular and started really a software revolution. A recent study that you've probably seen by now by Harvard Business School estimates the demand-side value of open source software today to $8.8 trillion. It's also estimated that more than 96% of all software being created today contains some open source component. So it's really difficult today to create software without using open source at all. And that's what the open source movement really created. So like everyone else, the companies that were built on providing software, on writing software, they adopted open source. They adopted open source really significantly, and they would develop in-house, but release the end product under an open source license. And that's what we call the single vendor open source software companies. They created software like they would in the old days and release it under an open source license, but they did not necessarily welcome contributions. And with the internet becoming more and more ubiquitous, a popular way of monetizing that open source software was to provide it software as a service. And that's when at the same time you had all of those hyperscaler cloud companies being formed up that also could easily provide the same software as a service to their users, and that was seen as unfair competition by those open source software companies. And so here we are in the 2020s, and today those companies say that while open source is really great to get that initial adoption, that initial visibility, it's bad for monetization. It's bad for business. And so if it's not business friendly, we need to create new licenses that will allow us to defend our business against the evil proprietary software approach and continue being in a good open source citizen, a good open source company, giving access to the software for free and not an evil proprietary software company. And sometimes those licenses, those restrictive licenses that I talked about, they would transform into an open source license after a few years. So really, you know, what's not to love? Why do you hate us, Thierry? They said. Well, it's because I think this narrative is built on three essential mistakes, three misconceptions that this talk is going to try to deconstruct. The first one is that open source is great because you don't have to pay for it. The second misconception is that single vendor open source is the reasonable way, the business conscious way of doing open source. And the third one is that proprietary is evil. So let's go and try to deconstruct all of those. Oops. First one, open source is great because you don't have to pay for it. And that's the key in all of those new licenses. They continue to give most people access to the source code for free. So they just need an additional small layer of protection in there, additional restrictions to prevent the freeloading by those massive companies mostly in the US and China. So what's not to love? Open source, the problem is open source is not great because you don't have to pay for it. Open source is great because everyone is free to use it. And that's a subtle distinction. I mean, cost is definitely a factor, but it goes beyond monetary barriers. It's really, what matters is really that you don't have to ask for permission. You can just use it. Anyone, anywhere, to do anything. Not just the ones with deep pockets, not just the ones in certain geographies. It's really this permissionless innovation that created the value that I mentioned, and it created, in turn, a ton of valuable software that was built on top of it, that itself got released under an open source license. And that's the virtuous cycle that we've seen over the past 20 years, creating this enormous value of $8.8 trillion. The non-compete licenses really restrict you from doing whatever the company that is issuing them dislikes or does not agree with. So in effect, they use pretty vague terms and pretty untested legally terms. So in the end, the net effect is that it stops this permissionless innovation. You have to ask a lawyer about it if you are doing any type of business with it. So you can no longer just use it. The second argument is that single vendor open source is the reasonable way of doing open source. It's the business conscious way of doing open source. We're the self-proclaimed commercial open source company, so we know what we're talking about. We are business conscious open source folks. But if we go back to the proprietary definition that I used earlier, a single entity owns the software that is being produced and intends to capture all value that derives from it. Well, single vendor open source companies are still doing what is essentially a proprietary approach to building software. They will disagree, and they've disagreed with it, but they still consider the software being produced as their exclusive property. They still intend to capture all value that derives from it. They aggregate copyright assignment to make sure that they can relicense, change the license anytime they want. So it's still proprietary. They just choose, for now, to release the software under an open source license. So single vendor open source is not the reasonable way to do open source. It's actually just another way to do proprietary. To me, it's just a relicensing time bomb. And a lot of those exploded over the past 2 years. And I think the proprietary development model decided to switch back from having tried open source licenses, having realized that it does not let them capture enough value, and move back to restrictive licensing now. It was predictable. It was predictable if only we had seen single vendor open source as the temporary tactic of proprietary software development that it always was. But we wanted to believe, I guess. Anyway, this whole rationale would not hold if we did not demonize proprietary software in the first place. The whole thing holds back on the fact that everyone hates proprietary software. And we oppose open source and proprietary a lot when we talk. But as we've seen, you can be proprietary. You can have a proprietary approach to writing software, a very exclusive approach to building software, and use open source licensing. So it's actually a bit more complex landscape than just open source versus proprietary. You can actually represent it as a quadrant. And on one axis, you have the licensing that you're using. That's pretty clear-cut. I mean, it's either a license that is approved by the open source initiative, or it's not. If it's a license that is approved by the open source initiative, it guarantees a number of freedoms, which ultimately make sure that you enable that permissionless innovation and that virtuous innovation cycle that I talked about. If you're not doing that, you're using a non-open source license. It comes with restrictions that will ultimately prevent this permissionless innovation. On the other axis, you have your approach to software development. It's either a proprietary approach, you want to be the only ones creating it, or you want to create it as a group and share the value across the group. So it's either a proprietary development or an open collaboration. And so software from the 80s and the 90s would be restricted software with a proprietary development approach using non-open source licensing. The openly developed open source that we've seen rising a lot in the 90s would be using open source licensing and being an open collaboration. And then in the 2000s and 2010s, we've seen single vendor open source as open source became overwhelmingly popular, the temptation to use open source licensing to get that initial visibility, to get access to those developers that were excited to buy the open source software. That's where single vendor open source is. And what we are seeing today is transition from the single vendor open source model to a restricted software model, basically the proprietary software development model, moving back from using open source licensing to using non-open source licensing. And that's fine. To me, proprietary software is fine. The problem is they're not very honest about it. They are not saying we're doing proprietary software, we're using restrictive licensing because we think it's the only way to make a business, we think it results in superior software or something else. They try to present it as an evolution on openness rather than a step back in the history that it really is. They want to avoid being associated with the evil proprietary software from the 90s and stay with the cool open source kids, I guess. But proprietary software is not evil. I mean, the abuse of dominant position in the 90s was certainly evil. But to me, the proprietary model itself, the approach to building software is not evil. In my opinion, it's just inferior. If you truly think that software created by a single entity is superior to software written in an open collaboration across a variety of actors, then yes, you should totally say that you're proud to do proprietary software. I just don't think it's true, but if that's your vision for building software, you should just be honest about it. What's really evil to me is the lies and the hypocrisy that is happening around this move. We're seeing people doing proprietary while pretending to be open, what we call open washing. Well, that's evil. Trying to dilute the meaning of the open source definition by creating deceptively named licenses like the Commons Clause, the server-side public license, the business software license, and others. That's evil. It's clearly designed to weaken the open source definition, weaken the open source initiative, weaken open source in the end. Switching licenses from under your community after having promised to be forever open source, like HashiCorp did, that's evil. And benefiting from the open source freedoms to create your software in the first place without having to ask for permission to anyone, having this whole body of open source software being available to them, building your software with it, and then releasing it under a restrictive license that basically says, well, you know what, this permissionless innovation thing doesn't really matter. What you want is software to be free. Well, I think that's evil. And so as a summary, I want to leave you with 3 takeaways. The first one is I think it's time for us to remind everyone that the permissionless innovation that we've been enjoying for the past 20 years should not be taken for granted. It is the direct consequence of the prevalence of open source licenses, the way they're defined by the open source initiative, coming with a number of freedoms that guarantee this permissionless innovation. It requires all of the open source freedoms, including the freedom to use it for any purpose and the freedom to build on it without having to ask for permission. I think it's also time for us to describe what a world where they win looks like. If their vision wins, if everyone adopts those restrictive licenses, well, all the innovation and that these open source freedoms have unleashed would come to a halt. We would quickly go back to the situation we had in software development in the 80s. And I've lived through that period. I discovered computers during the 80s. And let me tell you, you don't want to go there. You don't want to ask your lawyers every time you use a new library. You don't want to ask your lawyer every time you use a new programming language. They will say, you know, that in some cases, those licenses automatically revert to open source licensing after some time. But imagine a world where you have to use a 2-year-old buggy version with known vulnerabilities, because that's the one that is open source, because that's what's going to happen. And finally, I think it's time for us to reassert the value of software developed in an open collaboration. Everything else is proprietary. Everything else is a relicensing time bomb. So beware of the copyright license agreements when they are not held by an openly governed nonprofit, because they will be used to aggregate copyright and relicense against your will. Beware of single vendor open source software, because it's a proprietary model that happens to temporarily use open source licensing. Those companies have lots of money, lots of resources, and they are pushing a very unified message. And we're completely disorganized. So I think it's really time for us to really start engaging in those issues. And personally, I'll continue to say, even if that's unpopular in some areas and some people don't like it, that single vendor is the new proprietary. Thank you.